Are you clairvoyant? Can you see people's thoughts? Can you get shapes and feelings off the vibes of what others are thinking? Well, if you do, this video may be for you. If you are one of those people that are getting sensations and want to know more of what's happening with you, and this might give you a little bit more insight that it is a normal thing. It's a part of your senses that perhaps needs a little developing. And in the previous video, we covered the first section of this book titled Thought Forms by Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater. And as I mentioned in the past, a while back, the United States government, through the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, they conducted a study where they were using psychic people to do remote viewing to bring back intelligence, whether it's of locations or events that was happening remotely. That report was declassified, and I do have a video of that. Furthermore, in this video, we're going to explore what some artists rendered as they were getting information from clairvoyant people that were focusing on certain people and certain things and extracting the energy forms that was around them, their thought forms, as Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater were inferring. I believe that there's still a lot to learn when it comes to the human body, to the different senses, the extra or supernatural. And every day we learn something new. And just because we don't know now the science of it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. And if you're new to my channel and you found me at this video, I'm glad you found me. If you'd like to catch up with the previous video, please do visit my playlist and access that first video. And to my fellow subscribers, my family, my friends, you mean the world to me. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your comments. And thank you for being a part of this community. With an open mind, let's move on to this next section. Enjoy. Illustrative thought forms. For convenience of comparison, thought forms of a similar kind are grouped together. Affection. Vague, pure affection. Figure 8 is a revolving cloud of pure affection, and except for its vagueness, it represents a very good feeling. The person from whom it emanates is happy and at peace with the world, thinking dreamily of some friend whose very presence is a pleasure. There's nothing keen or strong about the feeling, yet it is one of gentle well-being, and of an unselfish delight in the proximity of those who are beloved. The feeling which gives birth to such a cloud is pure of its kind, but there is in it no force capable of producing definite results. An appearance by no means unlike this frequently surrounds a gently purring cat and radiates slowly outward from the animal in a series of gradually enlarging concentric shells of rosy cloud, fading into invisibility at a distance of a few feet from their drowsily contented creator. Vague selfish affection. Figure 9 shows us also a cloud of affection, but this time it is deeply tinged with a far less desirable feeling. The dull hard brown-gray of selfishness shows itself very decidedly among the carmine of love, and thus we see that the affection which is indicated is closely connected with satisfaction at favors already received and with a lively anticipation of others to come in the near future. Indefinite as was the feeling which produced the cloud in figure 8, it was at least free from its taint of selfishness, and it therefore showed a certain nobility of nature in its author. Figure 9 represents what takes the place of that condition of mind at a lower level of evolution. It would scarcely be possible that these two clouds would emanate from the same person in the same incarnation. Yet there is good in the man who generates the second cloud, though as yet it is partially evolved. A vast amount of the average affection of the world is of this type, and it is only by slow degrees that it develops towards the other and higher manifestation. Definite affection. Even the first glance at figure 10 shows us that here we have to deal with something of an entirely different nature, something effective and capable, something that will achieve a result. The color is fully equal to that of figure 8 in clearness and depth and transparency, But what was there a mere sentiment is in this case translated into emphatic intention coupled with unhesitating action. Those who have seen the book Man Visible and Invisible will recollect that in plate 11 of that volume is depicted the effect of a sudden rush of pure unselfish affection as it showed itself in the astral body of a mother, as she caught up her little child and covered it with her kisses. Various changes resulted from that sudden outburst of emotion. One of them was the formation within the astral body of large crimson coils or vortices lined with living light. Each of these is a thought form of intense affection generated as we have described, and almost instantaneously ejected towards the object of the feeling. Figure 10 depicts just such a thought form after it has left the astral body of its author and is on its way towards its goal. It will be observed that the most circular form has changed into one somewhat resembling a projectile or the head of a comet, and it will be easily understood that this alteration is caused by its rapid forward motion. The clearness of the color assures us of the purity of the emotion which gave birth to this thought form, while the precision of its outline is unmistakable evidence of power and of vigorous purpose. The soul that gave birth to a thought form such as this must already be one of a certain amount of development. Radiating affection. Figure 11 gives us our first example of a thought form intentionally generated, since its author is making the effort to pour himself forth in love to all beings. It must be remembered that all these forms are in constant motion. This one, for example, is steadily widening out, though there seems to be an exhaustless fountain welling up through the center from a dimension which we cannot represent. A sentiment such as this is so wide in its application that it is very difficult for anyone that thoroughly trained to keep it clear and precise. The thought form here is shown is, therefore, a very credible one, for it will be noted that all the numerous rays of the star are commendably free from vagueness. Peace and protection. Few thought forms are more beautiful and expressive than this which we see in Figure 12. This is a thought of love and peace, protection and benediction, sent forth by one who has the power and has earned the right to bless. It is not all probable that in the mind of its creator there existed any thought of its beautiful wing-like shape, though it is possible that some unconscious reflection of faraway lessons of childhood about guardian angels who always hovered over their charges may have had its influence in determining this. However that may be, the earnest wish undoubtedly clothed itself in this graceful and expressive outline, while the affection that prompted it gave to its lovely rose color, and the intellect which guided it shone forth like sunlight as its heart and central support. This, in sober truth, we may make veritable guardian angels to hover over and protect those whom we love, and many an unselfish earnest wish for good produces such a form as this, though all unknown to its creator. Grasping animal affection. Figure 13 gives us an instance of grasping animal affection, if indeed such a feeling as this be deemed worthy of the august name of affection at all. Several colors bear their share in the production of its dull, unpleasing hue, tinged as it is with a lurid gleam of sensuality, as well as deadened with the heavy tint indicative of selfishness. Especially characteristic is its form, for those curving hooks are never seen except when there exists a strong craving for personal possession. It is regrettably evident that the fabricator of this thought form had no conception of the self-sacrificing love which pours itself out in joyous service, never once thinking of result or return. This thought has been not how much can I give, but how much can I gain? And so it has expressed itself in these re-entering curves. It has not even ventured to throw itself boldly outward as do other thoughts, but projects half-heartedly from the astral body, which must be supposed to be on the left of the picture, a sad travesty of the divine quality love. Yet even this is a stage in evolution, and distinctly an improvement upon earlier stages, as will presently be seen. Devotion. Vague religious feeling, figure 14, shows us another shapeless rolling cloud, but this time it is blue instead of crimson. It betokens that vaguely pleasurable religious feeling, a sensation of devoutness rather than of devotion, which is so common among those in whom piety is more developed than intellect. In many a church, one may see a great cloud of deep, dull blue floating over the heads of the congregation, indefinite in outline, because of the indistinct nature of the thoughts and feelings which cause it, flecked too often with brown and gray, because ignorant devotion absorbs with deplorable facility the dismal tincture of selfishness or fear, but nonetheless adumbrating a mighty potentiality of the future, manifesting to our eyes the first faint flutter of one at least of the twin wings of devotion and wisdom, by the use of which the soul flies upward to God from whom it came. Strange is it to note under what varied circumstance this vague blue cloud may be seen, and oftentimes its absence speaks more loudly than its presence. For in many a fashionable place of worship we seek it in vain, and find instead of it a vast conglomeration of thought forms of that second type, which take the shape of material objects. Instead of tokens of devotion, we see floating above the worshippers the astral images of hats and bonnets, or jewelry and gorgeous dresses, of horses and carriages, of whiskey bottles and of Sunday dinners, and sometimes of whole rows of intricate calculations, showing that men and women alike have had during their supposed hours of prayer and praise no thoughts but of business or of pleasure, of the desires or the anxieties of the lower form of mundane existence. Yet sometimes in a humbler vein, in a church belonging to the unfashionable Catholic or ritualist, or even in a lowly meeting house where there is but little or learning or of culture, one may watch the deep blue clouds rolling ceaselessly eastward towards the altar, or upwards, testifying at least to the earnestness and the reverence of those who give them birth. Rarely, very rarely, among the clouds of blue will flash like a lance cast by the hand of a giant such a thought form as shown in figure 15, or such a flower of self-renunciation as we see in figure 16. It may float before our ravished eyes. Very rarely, among the clouds of blue will flash like a lance cast by the hand of a giant such a thought form as is shown in figure 15, or such a flower of self-renunciation as we see in figure 16 may float before our ravished eyes. But in most cases, we must seek elsewhere for these signs of higher development. Upward rush of devotion. The form in figure 15 bears much the same relation to that of figure 14 as did the clearly outlined projectile of figure 10 to the indeterminate cloud of figure 8. We could hardly have a more marked contrast than that between the inchoate placidity of the nebulosity in figure 14 and the virile vigor of the splendid spire of highly developed devotion which leaps into being before us in figure 15. This is no uncertain half-formed sentiment. It is the outrush into manifestation of a grand emotion rooted deep in the knowledge of fact. The man who feels such devotion as this one is one who knows in whom he has believed. The man who makes such a thought form as this is one who has taught himself how to think. The determination of the upward rush points to courage as well as conviction, while the sharpness of its outline shows the clarity of its creator's conception, and the peerless purity of its color bears witness to its utter unselfishness. The response to devotion. In figure 17, we see the result of this thought, the response of the logos to the appeal made to him, the truth which underlies the highest and best part of the persistent belief in an answer to prayer. It needs a few words of explanation. On every plane of his solar system, our logos pours forth his light, his power, his life, and naturally it is on the higher planes that this outpouring of divine strength can be given most fully. The descent from each plane to that next below, it means an almost paralyzing limitation, a limitation entirely incomprehensible except to those who have experienced the higher possibilities of human consciousness. Thus the divine life flows forth with incomparably greater fullness on the mental plane than on the astral, And yet even its glory at the mental level is ineffably transcended by that of the Buddhic plane. Normally, each of these mighty waves of influence spreads about its appropriate plane, horizontally, as it were, but it does not pass into the obscuration of a plane lower than that for which it was originally intended. Yet there are conditions under which the grace and strength peculiar to a higher plane may in a measure be brought down to a lower one, and may spread abroad there with wonderful effect. This seems to be possible only when a special channel is for the moment opened, and that work must be done from below and by the effort of man. It has before been explained that whenever a man's thought or feeling is selfish, the energy which it produces moves in a close curve, and thus inevitably returns and expands itself upon its own level. But when the thought or feeling is absolutely unselfish, its energy rushes forth in an open curve, and thus does not return in the ordinary sense, but pierces through into the plane above, because only in that higher condition, with its additional dimension, can it find room for its expansion. But in thus breaking through, such a thought or feeling holds open a door, to speak symbolically, of dimension equivalent to its own diameter, and thus furnishes the requisite channel through which the divine force appropriate to the higher plane can pour itself into the lower with marvelous results, not only for the thinker, but for others. An attempt is made in Figure 17 to symbolize this, and to indicate the great truth that an infinite flood of the higher type of force is always ready and waiting to pour through when the channel is offered, just as the water in a cistern may be said to be waiting to pour through the first pipe that may be opened. The result of the descent of divine life is a very great strengthening and uplifting of the maker of the channel, and the spreading all about him of a most powerful and beneficent influence. This effect has often been called an answer to prayer, and has been attributed by the ignorant to what they call a special interposition of providence, instead of to the unerring action of the great and immutable divine law. Self-renunciation. Figure 16 gives us yet another form of devotion, producing an exquisitely beautiful form of a type quite new to us, a type in which one might at first sight suppose that various graceful shapes belonging to animate nature were being imitated. Figure 16, for example, is somewhat suggestive of a partially open flower bud, while other forms are found to bear a certain resemblance to shells or leaves or tree shapes. Manifestly, however, these are not and cannot be copies of vegetable or animal forms, and it seems probable that the explanation of the similarity lies very much deeper than that. An analogous and even more significant fact is that some very complex thought forms can be exactly imitated by the action of certain mechanical forces, as has been said above. While with our present knowledge it would be unwise to attempt a solution of the very fascinating problem presented by these remarkable resemblances, it seems likely that we are obtaining a glimpse across the threshold of a very mighty mystery. For if by certain thoughts we produce a form which has been duplicated by the process of nature, we have at least a presumption that these forces of nature work along lines somewhat similar to the action of those thoughts. Since the universe is itself a mighty thought form called into existence by the Logos, it may well be that tiny parts of it are also the thought forms of minor entities engaged in the same work. And thus perhaps we may approach a comprehension of what is meant by the 330 million divas of the Hindus. This form is of the loveliest pale azure, with a glory of white light shining through it, something indeed to tax the skill, even the indefatigable artist who worked so hard to get them as nearly right as possible. It is what a Catholic would call a definite act of devotion. Better still, an act of utter selflessness or self-surrender and renunciation. Intellect. Vague intellectual pleasure. Figure 18 represents a vague cloud of the same order as those shown in figures 8 and 14. But in this case, the color is yellow instead of crimson or blue. Yellow in any of man's vehicles always indicates intellectual capacity, but its shades vary very much, and it may be complicated by the admixture of other hues. Generally speaking, it has a deeper and duller tint if the intellect is directed chiefly in lower channels, more especially if the objects are selfish. In the astral or mental body of the average man or business, it would show itself as yellow ochre, while pure intellect devoted to the study of philosophy or mathematics appears frequently to be golden, and these rises gradually to a beautiful clear and luminous lemon or primrose yellow when a powerful intellect is being employed absolutely unselfishly for the benefit of humanity. Most yellow thought forms are clearly outlined, and a vague cloud of this color is comparatively rare. It indicates intellectual pleasure, appreciation of the result of ingenuity, or the delight felt in clever workmanship. Such pleasure as the ordinary man derives from the contemplation of a picture usually depends chiefly on the emotions of admiration, affection, or pity which arouses within him, or sometimes if it portrays a scene with which he is familiar. Its charm consists in its power to awaken the memory of past joys. An artist, however, may derive from a picture a pleasure of an entirely different character, based upon his recognition of the excellence of the work and of the ingenuity which has been exercised in producing certain results. Such pure intellectual gratification shows itself in a yellow cloud, and the same effect may be produced by delight in musical ingenuity or the subtleties of argument. A cloud of this nature betokens the entire absence of any personal emotion, for if that were present, it would inevitably tinge the yellow with its own appropriate color. The intention to know. Figure 19 is of interest as showing us something of the growth of a thought form. The earlier stage, which is indicated by the upper form, is not uncommon and indicates the determination to solve some problem, the intention to know and to understand. Sometimes a theosophical lecturer sees many of these yellow serpentine forms projecting towards him from his audience and welcomes them as a token that his hearers are following his argument intelligently and have an earnest desire to understand and to know more. A form of this kind frequently accompanies a question, and if, as is sometimes unfortunately the case, the question is put less with the genuine desire for knowledge than for the purpose of exhibiting the acumen of the questioner, the form is strongly tinged with the deep orange that indicates conceit. It was at a theosophical meeting that this special shape was encountered, and it accompanied a question which showed considerable thought and penetration. The answer at first given was not thoroughly satisfactory to the inquirer, who seems to have received the impression that his problem was being evaded by the lecturer. His resolution to obtain a full and thorough answer to his inquiry became more determined than ever, and his thought form deepened in color and changed into the second of the two shapes, resembling a corkscrew even more closely than before. Forms similar to these are constantly created by ordinary, idle, and frivolous curiosity. But as there is no intellect involved in that case, the color is no longer yellow, but usually closely resembles that of decaying meat, somewhat like that shown in figure 29, as expressing a drunken man's craving for alcohol. High ambition. Figure 20 gives us another manifestation of desire, the ambition for place or power. The ambitious quality is shown by the high reach orange color, and the desire by the hooked extensions which precede the form as it moves. The thought is a good and pure one of its kind, for if there were anything base or selfish in the desire, it would inevitably show itself in the darkening of the clear orange hue by dull reds, browns, or grays. If this man coveted place or power, it was not for his own sake, but from the conviction that he could do the work well and truly, and to the advantage of his own fellow men. Selfish ambition. Ambition of a lower type is represented in figure 21. Not only have we here a large stain of the dull brown gray of selfishness, but there is also a considerable difference in the form. Though it appears to possess equal definite of outline, figure 20 is rising steadily onward towards a definite object, for it will be observed that the central part of it is definitely a projectile as figure 10. Figure 21, on the other hand, is a floating form and is strongly indicative of general acquisitiveness, the ambition to grasp for the self everything that is within sight. Anger. Murderous rage and sustained anger. In figures 22 and 23, we have two terrible examples of the awful effect of anger. The lurid flash from dark clouds, figure 22, was taken from the aura of a rough and partially intoxicated man in the East End of London as he struck down a woman. The flash darted out of her the moment before he raised his hand to strike, and caused a shuddering feeling of horror as though it might slay. The keen pointed stiletto like dart, figure 23, on the right, was a thought of a steady anger, intense and desiring vengeance, of the quality of murder, sustained through years and directed against a person who had inflicted a deep injury on the one who sent it forth. Had the latter been possessed of a strong and trained will, such a thought form would slay, and the one nourishing it is running a very serious danger of becoming a murderer in act as well as in thought in a future incarnation. It will be noted that both of them take the flash-like form, though the one on the left is irregular in its shape, while the one on the right represents a steadiness of intention which is far more dangerous. The basis of utter selfishness out of which the left one springs is very characteristic and instructive. The difference in color between the two is also worthy of note. In the left, on the dirty brown of selfishness is so strongly evident that it stains even the outrush of anger, while in the second case, though no doubt selfishness was at the root of that also, the original thought has been forgotten in the sustained and concentrated wrath. One who studies plate 18 in Man Visible and Invisible will be able to image to himself the condition of the astral body from which these forms are protruding, and surely the mere sight of these pictures, even without examination, should prove a powerful object lesson in the evil of yielding to the passion of anger. Explosive anger. In figure 24, we see an exhibition of anger of a totally different character. Here is no sustained hatred, but simply a vigorous explosion of irritation. It is at once evident that while the creators of the forms shown in figures 22 and 23 were each directing their ire against an individual, the person who is responsible for the explosion in figure 24 is for the moment at war with the whole world around him. It may well express the sentiment of some choleric old gentleman who feels himself insulted or impertinently treated, for the dash of orange intermingled with the scarlet implies that his pride has been seriously hurt. It is instructive to compare the radiations of this plate with those of figure 11. Here we see indicated a veritable explosion, instantaneous in its passing and irregular in its effects, and the vacant center shows us that the feeling that caused it is already a thing of the past, and that no further force is being generated. In figure 11, on the other hand, the center is the strongest part of the thought form, showing that this is not the result of a momentary flash of feeling, but that there is a steady continuous upwelling of the energy, while the rays show by their quality and length and the evenness of their distribution the steadily sustained effort which produces them. Watchful and angry jealousy. In figure 25, we see an interesting though unpleasant thought form. Its peculiar brownish-green color at once indicates to the practiced clairvoyant that it is an expression of jealousy, and its curious shape shows the eagerness with which the man is watching its object. The remarkable resemblance to the snake with raised head aptly symbolizes the extraordinarily fatuous attitude of the jealous person, keenly alert to discover signs of that which he least of all wishes to see. The moment that he does see it, or imagines that he sees it, the form will change into the far commoner one shown in figure 26, where the jealousy is already mingled with anger. It may be noted that here the jealousy is merely a vague cloud, though interspersed with very definite flashes of anger ready to strike at those by whom it fancies itself to be injured. whereas in figure 25, where there is no anger as yet, the jealousy itself has a perfectly definite and very expressive outline. Sympathy. Vague sympathy. In figure 18a, we have another of the vague clouds, but this time its green color shows us that it is a manifestation of the feeling of sympathy. We may infer from the indistinct character of its outline that it is not a definite and active sympathy, such as would instantly translate itself from thought into deed. It marks rather such a general feeling of commiseration as might come over a man who read an account of a sad accident or stood at the door of a hospital ward looking in upon the patients. Fear. Sudden fear. One of the most pitiful objects in nature is a man or an animal in a condition of abject fear. And an examination of plate 14 in Man Visible and Invisible shows that under such circumstances the astral body presents no better appearance than the physical. When a man's astral body is thus in a state of frenzied palpitation, its natural tendency is to throw off amorphous explosive fragments like masses of rock hurled out in blasting, as will be seen in figure 30. But when a person is not terrified but seriously startled, an effect such as that shown in figure 27 is often produced. In one of the photographs taken by Dr. Baraduc of Paris, it was noticed that an eruption of broken circles resulted from sudden annoyance. And this outrush of crescent-shaped forms seems to be of somewhat the same nature, though in this case there are the accompanying lines of matter which even increase the explosive appearance. It is noteworthy that all the crescents to the right hand, which must obviously have been those expelled earliest, show nothing but the livid gray of fear. But a moment later, the man is already partially recovering from the shock and beginning to feel angry that he allowed himself to be startled. This is shown by the fact that the later crescents are lined with scarlet, evidencing the mingling of anger and fear, while the last crescent is pure scarlet, telling us that even already the fright is entirely overcome and only the annoyance remains. Greed. Selfish greed. Figure 28 gives us an example of selfish greed, a far lower type than figure 21. It will be noted that here there is nothing even so lofty as ambition, and it is also evident from the tinge of muddy green that the person from whom this unpleasant thought is projecting is quite ready to employ deceit in order to obtain her desire. While the ambition of figure 21 was general in its nature, and the craving expressed in figure 28 is for a particular object towards which it is reaching out. For it will be understood that this thought form, like that in figure 13, remains attached to the astral body, which must be supposed to be on the left of the picture. Claw-like forms of this nature are very frequently to be seen converging upon a woman who wears a new dress or bonnet or some especially attractive article of jewelry. The thought form may vary in color according to the precise amount of envy or jealousy which is mingled with the lust for possession, but an approximation to the shape indicated in our illustration will be found in all cases. Not infrequently, people gathered in front of a shop window may be seen thus protruding astral cravings from the glass. Greed for drink. In figure 29, we have another variant of the same passion, perhaps at an even more degraded and animal level. This specimen was taken from the astral body of a man just as he entered at the door of a drinking shop. The expectation of and the keen desire for the liquor which he was about to absorb showed itself in the projection in front of him of this very unpleasant appearance. Once more, the hooked protrusions show the craving, while the color and the coarse mottled texture show the low and sensual nature of the appetite. Sexual desires frequently show themselves in an exactly similar manner. Men who give birth to forms such as this are as yet but little removed from the animal. As they rise in the scale of evolution, the place of this form will gradually be taken by something resembling that shown in figure 13, and very slowly, as development advances, that in turn will pass through the stages indicated in figures 9 and 8, until at last all selfishness is cast out, and the desire to have has been transmuted into the desire to give, and we arrive at the splendid results shown in figures 11 and 10. Various emotions. At a shipwreck. Very serious is the panic which has occasioned the very interesting group of thought forms which are depicted in figure 30. They were seen simultaneously arranged exactly as represented, though in the midst of an indescribable confusion. So the relative positions have been retained, though in explaining them it will be convenient to take them in reverse order. They were called forth by a terrible accident, and they are instructive as showing how differently people are affected by sudden and serious danger. One form shows nothing but an eruption of the livid gray of fear rising out of a basis of utter selfishness, and unfortunately there were many such as this. The shattered appearance of the thought form shows the violence and completeness of the explosion, which in turn indicates the whole soul of that person was possessed with blind, frantic terror, and that the overpowering sense of personal danger excluded for the time every higher feeling. The second form represents at least an attempt at self-control and shows the attitude adopted by a person having a certain amount of religious feeling. The thinker is seeking solace in prayer and endeavoring in this way to overcome her fear. This is indicated by the point of grayish blue which lifts itself hesitatingly upwards. The color shows, however, that the effort is but partially successful, and we see also from the lower part of the thought form, with its irregular outline and its falling fragments, that there is in reality almost as much fright here as in the other case. But at least this woman has had presence of mind enough to remember that she ought to pray, and is trying to imagine that she is not afraid as she does it, whereas in the other case there was absolutely no thought beyond selfish terror. The one retains still some semblance of humanity and some possibility of regaining self-control. The other has for the time cast aside all remnants of decency and is an abject slave to the overwhelming emotion. A very striking contrast to the humiliating weakness shown in these two forms is the splendid strength and decision of the third. Here we have no amorphous mass with quivering lines and explosive fragments, but a powerful, clear-cut, and defined thought, obviously full of force and resolution. For this is the thought of the officer in charge, the man responsible for the lives and safety of the passengers, and he rises to the emergency in a most satisfactory manner. It does not even occur to him to feel the least shadow of fear. He has no time for that. Though the scarlet of the sharp point of his weapon-like thought form shows anger that the accident should have happened, the bold curve of orange immediately above it betokens perfect self-confidence and certainty of his power to deal with the difficulty. The brilliant yellow implies that his intellect is already at work upon the problem, while the green, which runs side by side with it, denotes the sympathy which he feels for those whom he intends to save. A very striking and instructive group of thought forms. On the first night, figure 31 is also an interesting specimen, perhaps unique, for it represents the thought form of an actor while waiting to go upon the stage for a first night performance. The broad band of orange in the center is very clearly defined and is the expression of a well-founded self-confidence, the realization of many previous successes, and the reasonable expectation that on this occasion another will be added to the list. Yet in spite of this fear is a good deal of unavoidable uncertainty as to how this new play may strike the fickle public, and on the whole the doubt and fear overbalance the certainty and pride, for there is more of the pale gray than of the orange, and the whole thought form vibrates like a flag flapping in a gale of wind. It will be noted that while the outline of the orange is exceedingly clear and definite, that of the gray is much vaguer. The gamblers. The forms shown in figure 32 were observed simultaneously at the great gambling house at Monte Carlo. Both represent some of the worst of human passions, and there is little to choose between them, although they represent the feelings of the successful and the unsuccessful gambler respectively. The lower form has a strong resemblance to a lurid and gleaming eye, though this must be simply a coincidence, for when we analyze it we find that its constituent parts and colors can be accounted for without difficulty. The background of the whole thought is an irregular cloud of deep depression. heavily marked by the dull brown-gray of selfishness and the livid hue of fear. In the center, we find a clearly marked scarlet ring showing deep anger and resentment at the hostility of fate, and within that is a sharply outlined circle of black expressing the form as this is surely in imminent danger, for he has evidently descended into the very depths of despair. Being a gambler, he can have no principle to sustain him, so that he would be by no means unlikely to resort to the imaginary refuge of suicide, only to find an awakening into astral life that he had changed his condition for the worse instead of for the better, as the suicide always does, since his cowardly action cuts him off from the happiness and peace which usually follow death. The upper represents a state of mind which is perhaps even more harmful in its effects, for this is the gloating of the successful gambler over his ill-gotten gain. Here the outline is perfectly definite, and the man's resolution to persist in his evil course is unmistakable. The broad band of orange in the center shows very clearly that although when the man loses he may curse the inconstancy of fate, when he wins he attributes his success entirely to his own transcendent genius. Probably he has invented some system to which he pins his faith, and of which he is inordinately proud, but it will be noticed that on each side of the orange comes a hard line of selfishness, and we see how this in turn melts into avarice and becomes a mere animal greed of possession, which is also so clearly expressed by the claw-like extremities of the thought form. At a street accident, figure 33, is instructive as showing the various forms which the same feelings may take in different individuals. These two evidences of emotion were seen simultaneously among the spectators of a street accident, a case in which someone was knocked down and slightly injured by a passing vehicle. The persons who generated these two thought forms were both animated by affectionate interest in the victim and deep compassion for his suffering, and so their thought forms exhibited exactly the same colors, although the outlines are absolutely unlike. The one over whom floats that vague sphere of cloud is thinking, "Poor fellow, how sad," while he who gives birth to that sharply defined disc is already rushing forward to see in what way he can be of assistance. The one is a dreamer, though of acute sensibilities, the other is a man of action. At a funeral, in figure 34, we have an exceedingly striking example of the advantage of knowledge of the fundamental change produced in the man's attitude of a mind by a clear understanding of the great laws of nature which we live. Utterly different as they are in every respect of color and form and meaning, these two thought forms were seen simultaneously, and they represent two points of view with regard to the same occurrence. They were observed at a funeral, and they exhibit the feelings evoked in the minds of two of the mourners by the contemplation of death. The thinkers stood in the same relation to the dead man, but while one of them was still steeped in the dense ignorance with regard to superphysical life, which is so painfully common in the present day, the other had the inestimable advantage of the light of theosophy. In the thought of the former, we see expressed nothing but profound depression, fear, and selfishness. The fact that death has approached so near has evidently evoked in the mind of the mourner the thought that it may one day come to him also, and the anticipation of this is very terrible to him. But since he does not know what it is that he fears, the clouds in which his feeling is manifested are appropriately vague. His only definite sensations are despair and the sense of his personal loss, and these declare themselves in regular bands of brown, gray, and leaden gray, while the very curious downward protrusion, which actually descends into the grave and enfolds the coffin, is an expression of strong selfish desire to draw the dead man back into physical life. It is refreshing to turn from this gloomy picture to the wonderfully different effect produced by the very same circumstances upon the mind of the man who comprehends the facts of the case. It will be observed that the two have no single emotion in common. In the former case, all was despondency and horror, while in this case we find none but the highest and most beautiful sentiments. At the base of the thought form we find a full expression of deep sympathy, the lighter green indicating appreciation of the suffering of the mourners and condolence with them, while the band of deeper green shows the attitude of the thinker towards the dead man himself. The deep rose color exhibits affection towards both the dead and the living, while the upper part of the cone and the stars which rise from it testify to the feeling aroused within the thinker by the consideration of the subject of death, the blue expressing its devotional aspect, while the violet shows the thought of and the power to respond to a noble ideal, and the golden stars denote the spiritual aspirations which its contemplation calls forth. The band of clear yellow, which is seen in the center of this thought form, is very significant, as indicating that the man's whole attitude is based upon the prompted by his intellectual comprehension of the situation, and this is also shown by the regularity of the arrangement of the colors and the definiteness of the lines demarcating between them. The comparison between the two illustrations shown in this plate is surely a very impressive testimony to the value of the knowledge given by the theosophical teaching. Undoubtedly, this knowledge of the truth takes away all the fear of death and makes life easier to live because we understand its object and its end, and we realize that death is a perfectly natural incident in its course, a necessary step in our evolution. This ought to be universally known among Christian nations, but it is not. And therefore, on this point, as on so many others, Theosophy has a gospel for the Western world. It has to announce that there is no gloomy, impenetrable abyss beyond the grave, but instead of that, a world of life and light which may be known to us as clearly and fully and accurately as this physical world in which we live now. We have created the gloom and the horror for ourselves, like children who frighten themselves with ghastly stories, and we have only to study the facts of the case, and all these artificial clouds will roll away at once. We have an evil heredity behind us in this matter, for we have inherited all kinds of funeral horrors from our forefathers, and so we are used to them, and we do not see the absurdity and the monstrosity of them. The ancients were in this respect wiser than we, for they did not associate all this phantasmagoria of gloom with the death of the body, partly perhaps because they had a much more rational method of disposing of the body, a method which was not only infinitely better for the dead man and more healthy for the living, but was also free from the gruesome suggestions concocted with slow decay. They knew much more about death in those days, and because they knew more, they mourned less. On meeting a friend, Figure 35 gives us an example of a good, clearly defined and expressive thought form. With each color well marked off from the others, it represents the feeling of a man upon meeting a friend from whom he has been long separated. The convex surface of the crescent is nearest to the thinker, and its two arms stretch out towards the approaching friend as if to embrace him. The rose color naturally betokens the affection felt, the light green shows the depth of the sympathy which exists, and the clear yellow is a sign of the intellectual pleasure with which the creator of the thought anticipates the revival of delightful reminiscence of days long gone by. The appreciation of a picture. In Figure 36, we have a somewhat complex thought form representing the delighted appreciation of a beautiful picture upon a religious subject. The strong, pure yellow marks the beholder's enthusiastic recognition of the technical skill of the artist, while all other colors are expressions of the various emotions evoked within him by the examination of so glorious a work of art. Green shows his sympathy with the central figure in the picture. Deep devotion appears not only in the broad band of blue, but also in the outline of the entire figure, while the violet tells us that the picture has raised the man's thought to the contemplation of lofty ideal, and has made him, at least for the time, capable of responding to it. We have here the first specimen of an interesting class of thought forms, of which we shall find abundant examples later, that in which light of one color shines out through a network of lines of some quite different hue. It will be noted that in this case, from the mass of violet there rise many wavy lines which flow like rivulets over a golden plain. And this makes it clear that the loftiest aspirations is by no means vague, but is thoroughly supported by an intellectual grasp of the situation and a clear comprehension of the method by which it can be put into effect. Sympathy and love for all. Hitherto we have been dealing chiefly with forms which are the expression of emotion, or of such thought as is aroused within the mind by external circumstances. We have now to consider some of those caused by thoughts which arise from within, forms generated during meditation. each being the effect produced by conscious effort on the part of the thinker to form a certain conception or to put himself into a certain attitude. Naturally, such thoughts are definite, for the man who trains himself in this way learns how to think with clearness and precision, and the development of his power in this direction shows itself in the beauty and regularity of the shapes produced. In this case, we have the result of an endeavor on the part of the thinker to put himself into an attitude of sympathy and love towards all mankind. And thus we have a series of graceful lines of the luminous green of sympathy with the strong, roseate glow of affection shining out between them. Figure 37. The lines are still sufficiently broad and wide apart to be easily drawn, but in some of the higher examples of thought forms of this type, the lines are so fine and so close that no human hand can represent them as they really are. The outline of this thought form is that of a leaf, yet its shape and the curve of its lines are more suggestive of a certain kind of shell. So this is another example of the approximation to forms seen in physical nature, which we noted in commenting upon Figure 16. An aspiration to enfold all. In Figure 38, we have a far more developed example of the same type. This form was generated by one who was trying, while sitting in meditation, to fill his mind with an aspiration to enfold all mankind, in order to draw them upward towards the high ideal which shone so clearly before his eyes. Therefore it is that the form which he produces seems to rush out from him, to curve around upon itself, and to return to its base. Therefore it is that the marvelously fine lines are drawn in lovely luminous violet, and that from within the form there shines out a glorious golden light which is unfortunately quite impossible to reproduce. For the truth is that all these apparently intricate lines are in reality only one line circling around the form again and again with unwearied patience and wonderful accuracy. It is scarcely possible that any human hand could make such a drawing as this on this scale, and in any case the effect of its colors could not be shown. For it will be seen by experiment that if an attempt be made to draw fine violet lines close together upon a yellow background, a gray effect at once appears, and all likeness to the original is destroyed. But what cannot be done by hand may sometimes be achieved by the superior accuracy and delicacy of machine. And it is in this way that the drawing was made from which our illustration is reproduced, with some attempts to represent the color effect as well as the wonderful delicacy of the lines and curves. In the 6 directions, the form represented in Figure 39 is the result of another endeavor to extend love and sympathy in all directions, an effort almost precisely similar to that which gave birth to Figure 37, though the effect seems so different. The reasons for this variety and for the curious shape taken in this case constitute a very interesting illustration of the way in which thought forms grow. It will be seen that in this instance the thinker displays considerable devotional feeling and has also made an intellectual effort to grasp the condition necessary for the realization of his wishes, and the blue and yellow colors remain as evidence of this. Originally, this thought form was circular, and the dominant idea evidently was that the green of sympathy should be upon the outside, facing in all directions as it were, and that love should lie at the center and heart of the thought and direct its outgoing energies. But the maker of this thought form had been reading Hindu books, and his modes of thought had been greatly influenced by them. Students of Oriental literature will be aware that the Hindu speaks not of 4 directions, north, east, south, and west, as we do, but always of 6, since he very sensibly includes the zenith and the nadir. Our friend was imbued from this reading with the idea that he should pour forth his love and sympathy in the 6 directions. But since he did not accurately understand what the 6 directions are, he directed his stream of affection towards 6 equidistant points in his circle. The outrushing streams altered the shape of the outlying lines which he had already built up, and so instead of having a circle as a section of his thought form, we have this curious hexagon with its inward curving sides. We see thus how faithfully every thought form records the exact process of its upbuilding, registering ineffaceably even the errors of its construction. An intellectual conception of cosmic order. In Figure 40, we have the effect of an attempt to attain an intellectual conception of cosmic order. The thinker was obviously a theosophist, and it will be seen that when he endeavors to think of the action of spirit upon matter, he instinctively follows the same line of symbolism as the depicted in the well-known seal of the society. Here we have an upward pointing triangle signifying the threefold aspect of the spirit, interlaced with the downward pointing triangle, which indicates matter with its three inherent qualities. Usually we represent the upward triangle in white or gold and the downward pointing one in some darker hue such as blue or black. But it is noteworthy that in this case the thinker is so entirely occupied with the intellectual endeavor that no color but yellow is exhibited within the form. There is no room as yet for emotion of devotion, of wonder, or of admiration. The idea which he wishes to realize fills his mind entirely, to the exclusion of all else. Still, the definiteness of the outline, as it stands out against its background of rays, shows that he has achieved a high measure of success. The logos as manifested in man. We are now coming to a series of thoughts which are among the very highest the human mind can form when in meditation upon the divine source of its being. When the man in reverent contemplation tries to raise his thought towards the logos of our solar system, he naturally makes no attempt to image to himself that august being. Nor does he think of him as in any way possessing such form as we comprehend. Nevertheless, such thoughts build forms for themselves in the matter of the mental plane, and it would be of interest for us to examine those forms. In our illustration in Figure 41, we have a thought of the logos as manifested in man, with a devotional aspiration that he may thus be manifested through the thinker. It is this devotional feeling which gives the pale blue tinge to the five-pointed star, and its shape is significant, since it had been employed for many ages as a symbol of God manifest in man. The thinker may perhaps have been a Freemason, and his knowledge of the symbolism employed by that body may have had its share in the shaping of the star. It will be seen that the star is surrounded by bright yellow rays shining out amidst a cloud of glory, which denotes not only the reverential understanding of the surpassing glory of the deity, but also a distinct intellectual effort in addition to the outpouring of devotion. The logos pervading all. Our next three figures are devoted to the effort to represent a thought of a very high type, an endeavor to think of the logos as pervading all nature. Here again, as in Figure 38, it is impossible to give a full reproduction, and we must call upon our readers for an effort of the imagination, which shall to some extent supplement the deficiencies of the arts of drawing and printing. The golden ball depicted in Figure 42 must be thought of as inside the other ball of delicate lines, blue in color, which is drawn in Figure 44. Any effort to place the colors in such intimate juxtaposition on the physical plane results simply in producing a green blur, so that the whole character of the thought form is lost. It is only by means of the machine before mentioned that it is all possible to represent the grace and the delicacy of the lines. As before, a single line produces all wonderful tracery of Figure 44, and the effect of the four radiating lines making a sort of cross of light is merely due to the fact that the curves are not really concentric, although at first sight they appear to be so. Another conception. Figure 45 exhibits the form produced by another person when trying to hold exactly the same thought. Here also we have an amazing complexity of almost inconceivably delicate blue lines, and here also our imagination must be called upon to insert the golden globe from Figure 42 so that its glory may shine through at every point. Here also, as in Figure 44, we have that curious and beautiful pattern resembling somewhat the damascening on ancient oriental swords, or that which is seen upon watered silk or more antique. When this form is drawn by the pendulum, the pattern is not in any way intentionally produced, but simply comes as a consequence of the crossing of the innumerable microscopically fine lines. It is evident that the thinker who created the form upon Figure 44 must have held in his mind most prominently the unity of the logos, while he who generated the form in figure 45 has as clearly in mind the subordinate centers through which the divine life pours forth, and many of these subordinate centers have accordingly represented themselves in the thought form. The threefold manifestation. When the form employed in figure 46 was made, its creator was endeavoring to think of the logos in his threefold manifestation. The vacant space in the center of the form was a blinding glow of yellow light, and this clearly typified the first aspect, while the second was symbolized by the broad ring of closely knitted and almost bewildering lines which surround this center, while the third aspect is suggested by the narrow outer ring which seems more loosely woven. The whole figure is pervaded by the usual golden light gleaming out between the lines of violet. The sevenfold manifestations. In all religions, there remains some tradition of the great truth that the Logos manifests himself through 7 mighty channels, often regarded as minor logoi, or great planetary spirits. In the Christian scheme, they appear as the 7 great archangels, sometimes called the 7 spirits before the throne of God. The figure numbered 47 shows the result of the effort to meditate upon this method of divine manifestation. We have the golden glow in the center, and also, though with lesser splendor pervading the form, the line is blue, and it draws a succession of 7 graceful and almost feather-like double wings, which surround the central glory and are clearly intended as a part of it. As the thought strengthens and expands, these beautiful wings change their color to violet and become like the petals of a flower, and overlap one another in an intricate but exceedingly effective pattern. This gives us a very interesting glimpse into the formation and growth of these shapes in higher matter. Intellectual aspiration. The form depicted in figure 43 bears a certain resemblance to that in figure 15, but beautiful as that was, this is in reality a far higher and grander thought, and implies much more advanced development on the part of the thinker. Here we have a great clear-cut spear or pencil of the pure pale violet, which indicates devotion to the highest ideal, and it is outlined and strengthened by an exceedingly fine manifestation of the noblest development of intellect. He who can think thus must already have entered upon the path of holiness, for he has learned how to use the power of thought to very mighty effect. It will be noted that in both the colors there is a strong admixture of the white light, which always indicate unusual spiritual power. Surely the study of these thought forms should be a most impressive object lesson, since from it we may see both what to avoid and what to cultivate, and may learn by degrees to appreciate how tremendous is our responsibility for the exercise of this mighty power. Indeed, it is terribly true, as we said in the beginning, that thoughts are things and puissant things, and it behooves us to remember that every one of us is generating them unceasingly night and day. See how great is the happiness this knowledge brings to us, and how gloriously we can utilize it when we know of someone in sorrow or in suffering. Often circumstances arise which prevent us from giving physical help either by word or deed, however much we may desire to do so. But there is no case in which help by thought may not be given, and no case in which it can fail to produce a definite result. It may often happen that at the moment our friend may be too entirely occupied with his own suffering, or perhaps too much excited, to receive and accept any suggestion from without. But presently a time comes when our thought form can penetrate and discharge itself, and then assuredly our sympathy will produce its due result. It is indeed true that the responsibility of using such a power is great, yet we should not shrink from our duty on that account. It is sadly true that there are many men who are unconsciously using their thought power chiefly for evil, yet this only makes it all the more necessary that those of us who are beginning to understand life a little should use it consciously and use it for good. We have at our command a never-failing criterion. We can never misuse this mighty power of thought if we employ it always in unison with the great divine scheme of evolution and for the uplifting of our fellow man. Helpful thoughts. The figures numbered 48 to 54 were the results of a systematic attempt to send helpful thought by the friend who has furnished us with the sketches. A definite time was given each day at a fixed hour. The forms were in some cases seen by the transmitter, but in all cases were perceived by the recipient, who immediately sent rough sketches of what was seen by the next post to the transmitter, who has kindly supplied the following notes with regard to them. In the colored drawings appended, the blue features appear to have represented the more devotional element of the thought. The yellow forms accompany the endeavor to communicate intellectual fortitude or mental strength and courage. The rosy pink appeared when the thought was blended with affectionate sympathy. If the sender, A, could formulate his thought deliberately at the appointed time, the receiver, B, would report seeing a large, clear form as in figures 48, 49, and 54. The latter persisted for some minutes, constantly streaming its luminous yellow message upon B. If, however, A was of necessity experimenting under difficulty, say walking out of doors, he would occasionally see his forms broken up into smaller globes or shapes, such as 50, 51, 52, and B would report the receipt so broken up. In this way, many details could be checked and compared as from opposite ends of the line, and the nature of the influence communicated offered another means of verification. Upon one occasion, A was disturbed in his endeavor to send a thought of the blue-pink connotation by a feeling of anxiety that the nature of the pink element should not be misapprehended. The report of B was that a well-defined globe, as in figure 54, was first seen, but that this suddenly disappeared, being replaced by a moving procession of little light green triangles, as in figure 53. These few drawings give but a slight idea of the varied flower-like and geometric forms seen, while neither paint nor crayon work seems capable of representing the glowing beauty of their living colors. Forms built by music. Before closing this little treatise, it will perhaps be of interest to our readers to give a few examples of another type of forms unknown to those who are confined to the physical senses as their means of obtaining information. Many people are aware that sound is always associated with color, that when, for example, a musical note is sounded, a flash of color corresponding to it may be seen by those whose finer senses are already to some extent developed. It seems not to be so generally known that sound produces form as well as color, and that every piece of music leaves behind it an impression of this nature, which persists for some considerable time, and is clearly visible and intelligible to those who have eyes to see. Such a shape is perhaps not technically a thought form, unless indeed we take it, as we well may, as the result of the thought of the composer expressed by means of the skill of the musician through his instrument. Some such forms are very striking and impressive, and naturally their variety is infinite. Each class of music has its own type of form, and the style of the composer shows as clearly in the form with his music builds as a man's character shows in his handwriting. Other possibilities of variation are introduced by the kind of instrument upon which the music is performed, and also by the merits of the player. The same piece of music, if accurately played, will always build the same form, but that form will be enormously larger when it is played upon a church organ or by a military band, and not only the size but also the texture of the resultant form will be very different. There will also be a similar difference in texture between the result of a piece of music played upon a violin and the same piece executed upon the flute. Again, the excellence of the performance has its effect, and there is a wonderful difference between the radiant beauty of the form produced by the work of a true artist, perfect alike in expression and execution, and the comparatively dull and undistinguished looking one which represents the effort of the wooden and mechanical player. Anything like inaccuracy in rendering naturally leaves a corresponding defect in the form, so that the exact character of the performance shows itself such as clearly to the clairvoyant spectator as it does to the auditor. It is obvious that, if time and capacity permitted, hundreds of volumes might be filled with drawings of the forms built by different pieces of music under different conditions. so that the most that can be done within any reasonable compass is to give a few examples of the leading types. It has been decided for the purpose of this book to limit these to 3, to take types of music presenting readily recognizable contrasts, and for the sake of simplicity in comparison to present them all as they appeared when played upon the same instrument. A very fine church organ. In each of our plates, the church shows as well as the thought form which towers far into the air above it. And it should be remembered that though the drawings are on very different scales, the church is the same in all 3 cases, and consequently the relative size of the sound form can easily be calculated. The actual height of the tower of the church is just under 100 feet, so it will be seen that the sound form produced by a powerful organ is enormous in size. Such forms remain as coherent erections for some considerable time, an hour or 2 at least, and during all that time they are radiating forth their characteristic vibrations in every direction, just as our thought forms do. And if the music be good, the effect of those vibrations cannot but be uplifting to every man upon whose vehicles they play. Thus the community owes a very real debt of gratitude to the musician who pours forth such helpful influences, for he may affect for good hundreds whom he never saw and will never know upon the physical plane. Mendelssohn. The first of such forms, a comparatively small and simple one, is drawn for us in Plate M. It will be seen that we have here a shape roughly representing that of a balloon, having a scalloped outline consisting of a double violet line. Within that there is an arrangement of variously colored lines moving almost parallel with this outline, and then another somewhat similar arrangement which seems to cross and interpenetrate the first. Both of these sets of lines evidently start from the organ within the church, and consequently pass upward through its roof in their course, physical matter being clearly no obstacle to their formation. In the hollow center of the form float a number of small crescent arranged apparently in 4 vertical lines. Let us endeavor now to give some clue to the meaning of all this, which may well seem so bewildering to the novice, and to explain in some measure how it comes into existence. It must be recollected that this is a melody of simple character played once through, and that consequently we can analyze the form in a way that would be quite impossible with a larger and more complicated specimen. Yet even in this case we cannot give all the details, as will presently be seen. Disregarding for the moment the scalloped border, we have next within it an arrangement of 4 lines of different colors running in the same direction, the outermost being blue and the others crimson, yellow, and green respectively. These lines are exceedingly irregular and crooked. In fact, they each consist of a number of short lines at various levels joined together perpendicularly. It seems that each of these short lines represent a note of music, and that the irregularity of their arrangement indicates the succession of these notes, so that each of these crooked lines signifies the movement of one of the parts of the melody, the 4 moving approximate together denoting the treble, also tenor and bass respectively, though they do not necessarily appear in that order in this astral form. Here it is necessary to interpolate a still further explanation. Even with a melody so comparatively simple as this, there are tints and shades far too finely modulated to be reproduced on any scale at all within our reach. Therefore, it must be said that each of the short lines expressing a note has a color of its own, so that although as a whole that outer line gives an impression of blueness, and the one next within it of carmine, each yet varies in every inch of its length, so that what is shown is not a correct reproduction of every tint, but only the general impressions. The 2 sets of 4 lines which seem to cross one another are caused by 2 sections of the melody. The scalloped edging surrounding the whole is the result of various flourishes and arpeggios, and the floating crescents in the center represent isolated or staccato chords. Naturally, the arpeggio are not wholly violet, for each loop has a different hue, but on the whole they approach more nearly to that color than to any other. The height of this form above the tower of the church is probably a little over 100 feet, but since it is also extend downwards through the roof of the church, its total perpendicular diameter may well be about 150 feet. It is produced by one of Mendelssohn's later on works and is characteristic of the delicate filigree work which so often appears as the result of his compositions. The whole form is seen projected against a coruscating background of many colors, which is in reality a cloud surrounding it upon every side, caused by the vibrations which are pouring out from it in all directions. Gounod. In plate G, we have an entirely different piece, a ringing chorus by Gounod. Since the church in the illustration is the same, it is easy to calculate that in this case, the highest point of the form must rise fully 600 feet and above the tower, though the perpendicular diameter of the form is somewhat less than that, for the organist has evidently finished some minutes ago, and the perfected shape floats high in the air, clearly defined and roughly spherical, though rather an oblate spheroid. This spheroid is hollow, as are all such forms, for it's slowly increasing in size, gradually radiating outward from its center, but growing proportionately less vivid and more ethereal in appearance as it does so, until at last it loses coherence and fades away, much as a wreath of smoke might do. The golden glory surrounding and interpenetrating it indicates, as before, the radiation of its vibrations, which in this case show the dominant yellow in much greater proportion than did the Mendelssohn's gentle music. The coloring here is far more brilliant and massive than in plate M, for this music is not so much a thread of murmurous melody as a splendid succession of crashing chords. The artist has sought to give the effect of the chords rather than that of the separation notes, the latter being scarcely possible on a scale so small as this. It is therefore more difficult here to follow the development of the form, for in this much longer piece the lines have crossed and intermingled until we have little but the gorgeous general effect which the composer must have intended us to feel, and to see, if we were able to see. Nevertheless, it is possible to discern something of the process which builds the form, and the easiest point at which to commence is the lowest on the left hand as one examines the plate. The large violet protrusion there is evidently the opening chord of a phrase, and if we follow the outer line of the form upward and round the circumference, we may obtain some idea of the character of that phrase. A close inspection will reveal two other lines further in which run roughly parallel to this outer one, and slowly similar successions of color on a smaller scale, and these may well indicate a softer repetition of the same phrase. Careful analysis of this nature will soon convince us that there is a very real order in this seeming chaos, and we shall come to see that, if it were possible to make a reproduction of this glowing glory that should be accurate down to the smallest detail, it would also be possible patiently to disentangle it to the uttermost and to assign every lovely touch of coruscating color to the very note that called it into existence. It must not be forgotten that very far less detail is given in this illustration than in plate M. For example, each of these points or projections has within it as integral parts at least the 4 lines or bands of varying color which were shown as separate in plate M. But here they are blended into the one shade, and only the general effect of the chord is given. In M, we combined horizontally and tried to show the characteristics of a number of successive notes blended into one, but to keep distinct the effect of the 4 simultaneous parts by using a differently colored line for each. In G, we attempt exactly the reverse, for we combine vertically and blend not the successive notes of one part, but the chords, each probably containing 6 or 8 notes. The true appearance combines these two effects with an inexpressible wealth of detail. Wagner. No one who has devoted any study to these musical forms would hesitate in ascribing the marvelous mountain range depicted in plate W to genius of Richard Wagner, for no other composer has yet built sound edifices with such power and decision. In this case, we have a vast bell-shaped erection, fully 900 feet in height, and but little less in diameter at the bottom, floating in the air above the church out of which it has arisen. It is hollow like Gounod's form, but unlike that, it is open at the bottom. The resemblance to the successively retreating ramparts of a mountain is almost perfect, and it is heightened by the billowy masses of cloud which roll between the crags and give the effect of perspective. No attempt has been made in this drawing to show the effect of single notes or single chords. Each range of mimic rocks represents in size, shape, and color only the general effect of one of the sections of the piece of music as seen from a distance. But it must be understood that in reality, both this and the form given in Plate G are as full of minute details as that depicted in Plate M, and that all these magnificent masses of color are built up of many comparatively small bands which would not be separately visible upon the scale on which this is drawn. The broad result is that each mountain peak has its own brilliant hue, just as it is seen in the illustration. A splendid splash of vivid color, glowing with the glory of its own living light, spreading its resplendent radiance over all the country round. Yet in each of these masses of color, other colors are constantly flickering, as they do over the surface of molten metal, so that the coruscations and scintillations of these wondrous astral edifices are far beyond the power of any physical words to describe. A striking feature in this form is the radical difference between the two types of music which occur in it, one producing the angular rocky masses, and the other the rounded billowy clouds which lie between them. Other motifs are shown by the broad bands of blue hue and rose and green which appear at the base of the bell, and the meandering lines of white and yellow which quiver across them are probably produced by a rippling arpeggio accompaniment. In these three plates, only the form created directly by the sound vibrations has been drawn, though as seen by the clairvoyant it is usually surrounded by many other minor forms, the result of the personal feelings of the performer or the emotion aroused among the audience by the music. To recapitulate briefly, in Plate M we have a small and comparatively simple form portrayed in considerable detail, something of the effect of each note being given. In Plate G, we have a more elaborate form of very different character, delineated with less detail, since no attempt is made to render the separate notes, but only to show how each chord expresses itself in form and color. In Plate W, we have a still greater and richer form, in the depiction of which all detail is avoided, in order that the full effect of the piece as a whole may be approximately given. Naturally, every sound makes its impression upon astral and mental matter, not only those ordered successions of sounds which we call music. Some day, perhaps, the forms built by those other less euphonious sounds may be pictured for us, though they are beyond the scope of this treatise. Meantime, those who feel an interest in them may read an account of them in the little book on the hidden side of things. It is well for us ever to bear in mind that there is a hidden side to life, that each act and word and thought has its consequence in the unseen world which is always so near to us, and that usually these unseen results are of infinitely greater importance than those which are visible to all upon the physical plane. The wise man, knowing this, orders his life accordingly, and takes account of the whole of the world in which he lives, and not of the outer husk of it only. Thus he saves himself an infinity of trouble, and makes his life not only happier, but far more useful to his fellow men. But to do this implies knowledge, that knowledge which is power, and in our Western world such knowledge is practically obtainable only through the literature of theosophy. To exist is not enough. We desire to live intelligently. But to live we must know, and to know we must study. And here is a vast field open before us, if we will only enter upon it and gather thence the fruits of enlightenment. Let us, then, waste no more time in the dark dungeons of ignorance, but come forth boldly into the glorious sunshine of that divine wisdom which in these modern days men call theosophy. The end. And this is the end of the reading of Thought Forms by Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater. Please do hit that like button on your way out, leave a comment. If you find this of value, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel.